We want to move a little bit now and explore a connected but slightly different perspective. We want to look at systems, policies, regulatory frameworks, where they're falling short and where stronger evidence could help support change. So, to help explore this, I am joined by a panel of leaders who work across policy, advocacy, regulation, and system reform. Um, so this discussion is not about reviewing research that already exists. Instead, it is about identifying the questions that still need to be answered. Questions such as, where are the biggest barriers to accessible and inclusive communities? What evidence would help governments and regulators make better decisions? And what kinds of research could most effectively support real change in practice? So I would like to introduce you to our three panelists. Unfortunately, Rosemary, who is the Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, is unable to join us today. She sends her sincere apologies. But I am joined by Matthew Hall, who is the National Manager. He's going to wave at you now. He's the National Manager of Systemic Advocacy and Policy at the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. Many of us call it AFDO. He leads national work to influence policy and regulatory reform through disability-led advocacy and is currently co-chairing the Aviation Disability Standards co-design process. Next, I'd like to introduce Amy Crawford, who is going to wave at you now. Amy is the CEO of the Australian Local Government Association, representing over 500 councils across Australia. With more than 20 years' experience in the public service, she brings a strong track record in translating complex policy into practical outcomes across systems and jurisdiction. And certainly, last but not least, Alexandra Bignell. Alex is the Disability Inclusion Advisor at the City of Casey and a director across a number of national disability organisations. We would eat up the rest of our time if we read out Alex's CV, involvement, and experience. And her work focuses on embedding disability inclusion into planning and practice across local government and brings both professional expertise and lived experience to this work. So thank you very much for the three of you for joining today. Um, so our aim is not to cover everything, but help to identify where research could most usefully contribute to improving accessibility and inclusions in communities across Australia. So I'm starting with a big picture question first for all of you. And the question is, where are current policies, standards, or systems falling short when it comes to delivering genuinely accessible and inclusive communities? And part of this, I'm going to pop the question in the chat so that we're all reminding ourselves what we're answering. And I'm first going to go to Matthew and ask, what are you seeing from a systemic advocacy perspective about where we're falling short when it comes to delivering on accessible and inclusive communities?
Thanks very much, Sue, and thank you for having me participate today. It's a real privilege, and hopefully I'll provide some insight or assistance that will help everyone in the room. And welcome to everyone in the room. I'm coming to you today from Gunnedah country in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I think both Janes in the videos referred to something I think that is really important, where there is a big gap between, what's currently on paper or what currently people are saying and what's actually happening. And that is their comments around co-design. Jane Britt said, it's important to embed lived experience directly into decision-making and not merely consultation at the end of a process. And Jane Spring commented that we talk about co-design a lot, but what does it really mean in practice, and how can governments and businesses partner with people with disability effectively design policies and programs? And I think I think there is a real failure to understand what co-design means by many people, and what they think is co-design and what they are perhaps genuinely trying to implement is in fact not co-design, but something akin to consultation or listening. And I also think that we're seeing, particularly from some parts of government, and I should say my comments are not directed towards my current experience with the aviation disability standards. I think that is probably an exemplar that could be held up to the Australian Public Service as to what co-design is. But in other parts of the public service and in business, we're seeing a retreat from any meaningful co-design, even misunderstood co-design. And one example I just want to pick up is that the National Disability Insurance Agency publicly insists that it remains committed to co-design. My view is that if there is still that commitment, and I think they have walked away from their co-design commitments in April of last year, but if it is still a commitment, it's a commitment to processes that aren't co-design, and I don't think they understand what it means and what is needed for successful co-design. And there's simply one example, but an important example. So the agency's approach to co-design is documented, and they say that it means the voices of people with disability will be at the centre of how the agency, the department and the Quality and Safeguards Commission will design, implement and monitor NDS reforms. We will listen to and work with the disability community, NDIS participants, their families and carers and disability support providers. And that is not, in my view, an approach to co-design. It doesn't centre the voices of the participants in that process. And B, it's not collaborative or inclusive where participants are actively involved in shaping the policies and processes and decisions that affect their lives. Co-design goes beyond merely listening to people with disability and goes beyond consulting them by ensuring that people with disability are true partners in decision making and we're not just contributors.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Matthew. Amy, I'm going to take you away from the NDIS. So the Australian Local Government Association is a signatory to Australia's disability strategy. So I'll take you back to the question, which is around where are things falling short when it comes to delivering genuinely accessible and inclusive communities? How does that show up for your constituents, do I call them? Members of your association nationally?
Yeah, wonderful. And thank you so much for the invitation as well. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. And it's so fantastic to be here to talk in depth about this key issue in our national framework. So, like you said, ALGA is a signatory to the disability strategy. And that strategy, I think, therein represents the trickiness of our federation. So, as you said, I'm a bit of a policy geek, and I've spent a lot of my time working in the joy that is a federated system, all our states and territories, and then our Commonwealth government system trying to come together and bring a common objective through that strategy. My job at the moment are 538 councils. We represent the 538 councils across Australia. And I'm still heavily involved in that idea of the federation. So the national system, you're saying, where's the sort of system difficulty here? It's trying to get a intent and implementation that looks right down to the practical level. So we sign up to these really large agreements. We sign up to the strategies. We sign up to conventions. We see our governments put through legislation. So I believe the intent is there of our nation to support, but where it's falling down in that evidence base is down to the practical implications. How do these things translate down into the ground? How do my wonderful councils across Australia, how do they implement that good intent? We would love to see some research on the lack of nationally consistent standards. Different states and territories have different legislation. Commonwealth puts its broad intent over the top. This is different regulatory environments. So we'll have councils across Australia working to slightly different standards, whether that be physical environment or governance environment. And it can make it harder to deliver outcomes for people, for our communities. It can also make it hard. This is super practical, but procurement. You think about the power of procurement. If the standards are slightly different across each state and territory, a savvy business person may not be there to help us meet those procurement needs. So consistency could really help. We also want to see that shared, stronger evaluation. So again, that consistency, so we can learn from successful initiatives across different states, territories, across different local government areas. We think that that will also help us with our evaluation. So if we bring our mind down to, as so many wonderful people have already talked about today, community-led, what do our communities want and need? Let's see where those key evaluation points are and then roll it up. Whereas at the moment, it does feel very much like a top-down implementation.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Amy. That emphasis on trickle down, which often doesn't happen in these instances. Alex, as one of the as a person who works within one of the 538 local councils, as well as a person with lived experience, from your experience inside a local council, where do you see things breaking down?
I'm actually going to preface that answer with a little bit of an explanation about where councils sit in this framework, and it's really going to build on what Amy was saying. And local government is the last layer. It's the layer that integrates with the community. Each of those 538 councils is very different. It's different because of our demographics. It's different because of our the region that they're located. And it's really about understanding that local government has huge opportunities to actually create place-based solutions to some of the problems our communities face. And I also want to illustrate that we don't just do town planning or look at community facilities, things like that. We actually are paying so much more attention to social inequity, and we're paying attention to the experiences of marginalised groups. And we're paying attention to not just people with disability, but the intersectional experiences of having disability within a community. And I think that one of the other things I wanted to add is that we have at our disposal one of the most important policy tools you can have, and that's an action plan. And we work within a really sophisticated integrated planning system, which, as we've heard, doesn't always link, it doesn't always work properly, but it should actually link from the National Disability Strategy down into the state and territory strategies. And then we have our action plans. And an action plan looks at policy with a lower P. So it could be policy, programs, services, initiatives. There can be 10 to 70 actions in an action plan. So these are huge opportunities across all of our service areas to actually make change. And so my question is always, how do we decide what is going to have the most impact? Policy is not a neutral space. It has a position of power. We have a position of power to determine who we include, who is rendered invisible, and how we allocate those precious resources in terms of time and money to actually have real impact on things that people with disability actually value. And there is research out there, very tentative research about what are the key enablers for change in social policy. This research I'm thinking of really looks at health inequities, but it actually identifies 5 enablers for change. And I think they can be linked very easily into action plans if we can translate them into things that policymakers, community development specialists, urban planners even, how can they translate these wonderful enablers into things that will actually have an impact? And a key enabler for change might be broadly restructuring the environment. Great, that sounds really exciting, but what does that mean on the ground? Another one is partnerships, but how does that work, and how does that actually create change? So this is a really systemic view, and it's acknowledging that a lot of municipal policy is really focused on downstream issues and intermediary determinants of health, less so on the main determinants of health, but also what are the structural barriers? What are the things that actually start in that policy space that can actually bring about real change?
Sue speaking. And thank you. I just want to acknowledge that we have three very passionate people on the panel today. And I realise for Cornelia and Sue, our Auslan interpreters, we might need to slow down. And our captioner, Helen, we might just need to slow down a little bit. I don't want to dampen that enthusiasm, but I want to make sure that we can all stay connected. Thank you, all three of you, for that sort of big, bold first question. I'm going to move on to our next question about evidence gaps. And I'll just post that in the chat before I read it out. Where are the most significant evidence gaps that are holding back progress? And what evidence do decision makers actually need to understand not just the costs, but also the benefits and the broader impacts of inclusion as well? Matthew, I'll go to you again first, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Well, Alexandra just made a really important comment, I think, and that is, posing the question, how do we measure the impact of a proposal or a reform? And Jeff, in his video message, also commented that we need research that measures the social and economic impact of communities that are accessible. And I think the question of what is the value, or how do you value the benefit of accessibility, is a really, really important question, of which there is a sparse amount of evidence to help answer. At the federal level, the Commonwealth Government is committed to the use of cost-benefit analysis to assess regulatory proposals to encourage better decision-making. This involves a systematic evaluation of the impacts of a proposal, accounting for all of the effects on the community and the economy, not just immediate or direct effects, and not just financial effects or effects on one group. But it is incredibly limited in its value, I think, because it seeks to value the gains and losses from a proposal in pure monetary terms. Its purpose is to assess the economic impact of government regulation and whether the regulation will deliver a net gain to society. It is fantastic for those things that have a monetary value. It's less useful for those things that are qualitative or indirect, of which many, many benefits of accessibility are. It is impossible to put a value on the benefit of comfort or a lack of stigma, or it's very, very difficult. Maybe it's not impossible. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but it seeks to reduce to what is a singular familiar measurement, that is dollars, as to determine whether or not a change is worthwhile. And I think the challenge for me and for anyone else involved in systemic advocacy and disability policy, and certainly a challenge in the current development of the co-design of aviation disability standards, is how do you value in dollar terms, and if you can, should you value in dollar terms, the benefit to society of recognising an individual's dignity as a human being? How do you value comfort or lack of stigma or ease of use or saving of time? And perhaps as importantly, how do you value the cost of a denial of your human rights? Now, the OECD proposed in 2017, so nearly 10 years ago, a framework for identifying and measuring the benefits of accessibility, recognising that most proposals view cost as a limiting factor on what public and private entities can be compelled to provide, even when that is a legally enshrined human rights obligation. And recognise that when addressing the application of accessibility, Regulators and governments and courts seem to deal comprehensively with costs, but fail to value benefit, such as reduction in stigmatic harm, option benefits, and what they call existence value and capability value. Now, over the last 10 years, that paper in academic publications has been cited a total of 9 times, so not even once a year, and not in any Australian research. So there's been no consideration in this country of how, or if, and if so, how can you adequately account for the benefits of a more accessible and inclusive society or a more accessible and inclusive program. And that's something that I think would move, it would be a game changer in terms of being able to justify accessibility in our polity.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Matthew. Alex, you talked about systemic inequities and intersectional inequities before. So in your work, how do you translate research into policy and planning cycles? How do you measure impact quantitatively and qualitative so we don't lose people in that data?
I think just wanted to make a comment. I think we're all reading from the same playbook, which is amazing. So I'm going to just quickly touch on the policy cycle. And before anybody's eyes glaze over, the policy cycle is amazing. And I think we need to look at it more and to answer some of these questions. The policy cycle prevents us from going off a cliff and just doing things for the sake of doing them. It actually ensures that we are making good decisions that are based on the needs of people with lived experience. And when I'm saying lived experience, I'm meaning people with disability and all those wonderful intersecting identities. So there's a couple of parts to the policy cycle that are important. I'll just run through it so you know. It's like identifying a need, talking to stakeholders, co-design, implementation and design, and then monitoring and evaluation, and around it goes. Now, I guess a good example I could give you is probably some research that we're doing at the City of Casey around customer experience. I guess my cat, Sunny. And we're seeking to understand what this experience is of people who are intersecting with play spaces in kindergartens. Now, why this is really important is because this is the point where a lot of parents intersect with services for the first time. It's where they're seeing their little people start to show signs of autism or developmental delay. And for many who's maybe if you're English isn't your first language, you're from a migrant or refugee community, you're experiencing family violence, or you have lived experience of disability as well, this can be a really sensitive time. And I wanted to touch on the wonderful point that one of the panel made. Because of my working memory, I'm prevented from remembering who that was, so I do apologise. But the comment was about, and now I've just forgotten the comment, but I'll circle around and my brain will hand it back to me. But the idea is really to understand that intersection into play spaces and develop policy. That was it, quantitative. We count how many people are coming through play spaces in kindergartens. But it's actually about what are their experiences? What's all that wonderful qualitative research tell us about the barriers that they face? And this allows us to change our policies, but our processes, the way we intersect, the way we maybe help little people with accommodations within kindergartens and play spaces, how we assist parents who don't have access to services, because we do acknowledge we do have some pretty big service gaps. So I would say that we are embracing research in local government, and we're embracing it because of the wonderful human complexity that we can get from qualitative research and understanding the intersectional experience of living with disability and having all those other identities that can create barriers.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Alex. And Amy, just sort of draw us back a little bit out of the playground at the local kindy, if that's all right. What does good evidence look like from ALGA's perspective so that you can continue to, I suppose, work towards what you've signed up to in Australia's disability strategy, support those councils to keep moving forward? What does good evidence look like for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, as Alex pointed out, we have 538 councils. Each one of them is very different. What I loved, thank you for raising it, Alex, was the policy cycle. It's the dark arts of how things get funding through the Commonwealth eventually. And Alex raised a really good point about early evaluation. So, an understanding, we'd love to see the evidence built in a clear evaluation framework that helps us look from a consistency across what's working and what's not working. And where it would be fantastic from a local government view is support with building that clear evaluation framework. As Alex said, each council is doing amazing work. If we can help build that consistency at the evaluation level, that can then help our councils roll that into national data. And then that rolls into national evaluation that our policymakers can look at and see what is and isn't working. I think a really clear part of that evaluation framework, as mentioned, is the lived experience and co-design. Like moving beyond the counting the numbers, as Alex said, don't just count the numbers, but counting what it means and what it then creates. And co-design can also be bringing in your external parties in terms of that analysis of the larger community benefits. So the long-term social and economic benefits of accessibility. So really, by stealth, if we can get that type of framework developed and we can have both lived experience co-design, plus we can bring in the people, the economists, the people who are of that experience who can bring in the long-term social and economic benefits, we can get a stronger use, a case use. We can get a better sharing of lessons and outcomes across jurisdictions. And we all know that every government, federal, state, local, is under financial pressure. So we really want to give them that evidence to show what is the best spend of their dollar. And we know it on the ground level. It's getting that evidence to prove it up to our policymakers. That is the hard bit.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to stay with you if that's all right. And we're going to shift that question to a slightly different angle in what actually influences change.
Hayden, you have a reach on it too? Yep, that's it.
Sorry, I'm just going to find who that is and mute. Sorry. Yeah, so what kinds of research or evidence have you seen actually influence policy or regulatory change? So not just inform it, but genuinely shift decisions.
So we always advocate for on the ground, place-based, grounded in lived experience. That is our goal. Where we have seen great change in influencing policy is where we've seen the different states and Commonwealth align on their objective. I'll use a non-disability policy area. Adaptation, the National Adaptation Plan. We are starting to see some really key structural changes happen where the states and the Commonwealth are lining up on the outcome, and then that's helping us change how the policy and ultimately, we're hoping, the funding will flow down to the implementation. So the adaptation work is an example of that for us was our ability to use our own research. We did some national adaptation research. This was then put into the federal government, and it's being put into the federal architecture, the federal financial agreements. And then that is like a hook that we can hang our evaluation hat on, or we can hang our funding needs on, because all the governments have agreed. So we would love to see more comparative and international evidence. There's such cool research out there. Let's not start from scratch. Another thing that really does speak to the federal government in particular is that long-term vision. So the wellbeing framework, Treasury has its wellbeing framework. I think that line has been drawn in the sand now, and we can absolutely say your wellbeing framework is for everyone. Therefore, if you want to get to that change of regulation or change of policy and change of funding arrangements, you need to line up that research to that wellbeing framework that Treasury, people who get to hold the money, is in charge of.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Amy. Now, Matthew, I say this in the most respectful way. You've been in your role or around for a little while, and I'm keen to know from an advocacy perspective the answer to this question. What cuts through? What informs, but also genuinely shift decisions, please?
I think the simple answer to that question, Sue, is the stories of real people grounded in their lived experience, to shift people's mindsets and to shift people's attitudes. I think a well-told story of the barriers that a person faces, you can see the lights go on and the shutters lift in people's faces as they finally have some understanding of what does it mean to have to deal with a particular barrier that this person is describing on a daily basis. And we saw that in the aviation co-design workshops, where we had 30 people, all from facing different barriers, from different life experiences, from different places in Australia, from regional and rural and remote and urban centres, and it was like there were things where people even other people with disability in the room were seeing or getting a different perspective of the barriers that others face when trying to navigate an airport or an airline or an aeroplane, and whilst it might not necessarily shift to changes in immediate changes in practices or procedures, it certainly started, I think, different conversations, particularly around issues around security screening and those sorts of things, where a deaf blind person was telling their experience of having to go through security and being physically separated from their interpreter because, God forbid, they might be telling them how to bomb the plane. I don't quite know what the rationale is, but two people can't go through at once and they can't be communicating with each other, and yet this person has no idea what they're being asked or what they're being asked to do, and are completely at a loss of things. So I think my short answer is that real life lived experience or lived expertise of a person, and then the challenge is to turn that into something of more general application, and to then assess how the change that is needed will have perhaps greater application than for the individual. You have to turn that compelling story into something of broader application or broader significance, and then try and deal with the question of quantification of that benefit.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Matthew. Alex, I suppose across the different places that you advocate, so obviously your day job, for want of a better term, as well as the other places, what would you add? What actually lands? So in a council environment where we are looking for that very practical community experience, what does land? What does influence change?
I wholeheartedly agree with what Matthew has said. It needs to be grounded in lived experience, but I'm just going to flip it to the other side and tell you what the practitioners need, the policymakers, and just remembering that disability inclusion decisions or accessible decisions aren't just made by disability inclusion practitioners, they're made by urban planners, landscape architects, all sorts of professionals who and may not have had that deep understanding of universal design, or even an understanding, as Matthew so beautifully pointed out, the why. There's no real why would we do these things. So translation for me is the answer. Translate research into something we can use. We love guides, we love principles, we love all those things, because without them, we can't address the huge gap we have with the legislation and standards which exist for some things like premises, buildings. We don't always have those standards, for example, within open spaces. This is technical local government language, and play spaces. So, one great example of public realm guidance that is informed by research, and there's so many more, but this is a great one, is the New South Wales Government Everyone Can Play framework, which embeds universal design principles into the way play spaces are designed, recognising that play spaces aren't just for children, they're for entire households, because a lot of children can't go there unless someone from the household's there. What if that person has dementia? What if that person is older? What if that person is autistic or neurodivergent or has a disability? So these are sites of intergenerational being together, and this really, is what we're talking about, community participation. But the other big one that I can just see glaring at me constantly is there's no guidance around cognitive and sensory access. Okay, so we have a lot of information about physical access, but we're not thinking about the existential experience of what people, who experience sensory overload and can't interpret, can't do any wayfinding like myself because we're so completely overwhelmed. So I'd be really keen to have something that translates that into tools that practitioners within local government can actually use in addition to co-design. So those tools are not to be, considered as a tick box for accessibility. We need to still be informed by lived experience, but they certainly go a long way into helping professionals understand what needs to be done.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Alex. Matthew I want to switch now, if that's okay, probably switch back slightly to co-design and the role of co-design. And Matthew gave us a very frank assessment on where the biggest player is at the moment in this, the agency, for that smaller group of people who do have an NDIS or access to the NDIS, and remembering that the large majority of Australians with disability do not have access to something like the NDIS. They are relying on what happens in their local community. So, Alex, sorry, I'm going back to you again,
Yes,
putting pressure on you. How, as you said, where there's those places without guidance, there's places without structure. How do you use co-design to design those things from the start rather than retrofitting? Because I know that's something that you and I talked about, the cost of retrofitting, and not just the cost as in the money, but the cost to lost time, lost opportunity, lost community connections. How do we use co-design to make sure we're getting that from the start? And yeah.
So when you engage with communities, one very common piece of feedback is, how do we ensure accessibility right from the start, recognizing that need to retrofit as we roll something out, again, the policy cycle, without the beautiful co-design element of talking to stakeholders. But the thing that I think about isn't just about how do we make it more accessible for people with disability to be part of co-design. And there's so much research about how we are more accessible for neurodivergent people, people with intellectual disability. So looking at different disability types to think about how we can be more accessible. And I'm invoking the ladder of participation here, which touches on Matthew Hall's comment about it's not co-design, it's really information sharing or even tokenistic information sharing. So what makes co-design actually co-design? And I think the heart of the issue that we don't talk about enough is about the role of institutions in determining how policies should be rolled out and how they see that intersection with people with disability as an advantage and an opportunity or a threat and a barrier. Because co-design it's putting people in a room with human complexity with an institution that's really trying to be standardized, it's trying to be, nice and clean. And then how do we get in there and build the confidence of organizations and local government to negotiate the parameters of our solution, our strategy? And I think if we address that, it would really speak to building the confidence of organizations to actually address co-design properly.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Alex. Matthew, outside of the NDIS,
Yes.
what else are you seeing? I mean, you've spoken positively about what's happened in the airspace. What's that thing called? The airlines and the aviation. That was the word I'm looking for. Thank you. The aviation space. But outside of that, what else are you seeing around co-design leading to policy and systems reform that you wanted to bring to this audience for them to consider when they're pulling together their research?
Well, I think, Sue, the first point to make is I think there is a real reluctance within bureaucracies and institutions to accept, certainly within our political system, to accept that true co-design is possible or that it's appropriate within a Westminster parliamentary democracy that then is complicated by operating, as Alexandra said, operating within the federal framework with additional layers of cooperation and negotiation and the occasional conflict. Where a system of government is built on majority rule. I think there are some people who I think who pose arguments based on sort of democratic principles, but I think it's important to remember that an election decides who governs us, but not how they should govern. And democracy is not only a counting exercise; it's an exercise in listening and collaborating and doing, I suppose. I think there's a real fear around the sharing of power, and that might lead to some form of anarchy, or I don't quite know what. But I think the barriers that institutions, through their own either assumptions or cultural or other backgrounds, have that are barriers to co-design. And I think largely the issue of sharing power and having other people, sorry, there's a mosquito in my face, controlling the process is a real difficulty. And to have people accept that they are in a sense giving up some of their power through a co-design exercise, because they will have to, if they're fair income about it, they'll have to take what the co-design process delivers and turn that into workable policy or processes or governance. I certainly think that the process that the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Community, Sport and the Arts, which is a mouthful, is going through in terms of the co-design of the aviation specific disability standards under the Disability Discrimination Act, puts the lie to any old world view of co-design. It does not work and cannot work within a Westminster parliamentary democracy and bureaucracy. One thing I would also add, however, is that I think certainly when working with government as opposed to private institutions, but also perhaps in that context, we do need to recognise that there's a separation between the co-design of a policy or a system and then the bureaucratic and political processes involved in government adopting that policy or system.
Yeah.
And so, as an example, so we have done a lot of work and we've been involved very, very directly in the co-design of draft standards, and a consultation paper, I understand, will be released shortly for public consultation. But the political decision of what to do with that lies with the minister, and the minister relies on the fearless and frank advice of her public servants. It is not our position as the co-design steering committee to provide that frank and fearless advice to the minister. That was the role of the department and the bureaucracy. We design a process and then they give some advice to the minister about that. And we were not involved, and I don't think we should have been involved, in the briefing paper that went to the minister from the department about the process and what was being recommended. But to the credit of the department, the co-design partners were invited, and we took up this opportunity to provide our own note to be included in the briefing paper, but our own note about the process and what we saw as the benefits of the process and where we believe that we've got to because of that process. So, there is, I think we do need to understand, and I don't know to what extent it's a research question, but certainly there needs to be, a much better understanding, of what co-design is, but also then within political or bureaucratic or even commercial processes, what co-design is not.
Yeah.
Sue speaking. Thank you. Amy, I imagine that the appetite in those 538 councils for co-design is strong. I imagine it means different things to different people, obviously based on their experience and the communities that they're working for or working with. But how does co-design and I suppose the power of research as well show up across local government systems?
I think it's often, as Matthew was just pointing out, we're in a Westminster political system, or Westminster for the Commonwealth, and there's an element here of accountability back to our communities. So research is often used to help show our wonderful ratepayers where their tax dollar is going. And so there's an importance there of saying, we took this decision for this reason, and that reason is because we listened to the people who this was intended to serve. So co-design comes back to that very important kernel of why a decision was taken. And we think for our researchers on the line, there's some great pieces out there about helping look to what are the best co-design approaches for different circumstances, how it might be embedded into governance decision, the governance model, because our councils are often running on, as we say, the smell of an oily rag. They want to do great work, but they don't have the research dollars, the evidence dollars to go out there and do this themselves. So the more that we can find researchers who can bring together, this is a fantastic co-design model for if you're doing this type of work, and show the key elements of it, enable the council to, as Alex said before, pick up the guide, pick up the advice and go, okay, I can implement that in my current system in this way, rather than expecting them to start from scratch, start from the blank page. So we really want to see how that research can encourage everyone to embed it into their systems, into their governance models, how they can use that to talk back to their communities and help show the importance of the decisions that they have been made, and by having that kind of co-design research, we can get that into the centre of our decision making.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Amy. Just before I pose the last question to our panel today, Alex, Ruth had a question for you. And Ruth, if you want to turn your microphone on, it'd be great if you want to ask your question.
It's about like getting older for people with disabilities. Yeah, and that's my fear because I'm about to be 30 this year in April. So yeah, so I just don't know what it is because it can be a family growth inside my body. So I just don't know what's happening. So it's very scary for people with intellectual disability.
I think, Ruth, you raise a really good point in our discussion around intersectionality and understanding all the different lived experiences. So that experience for you is going to impact how you might make decisions about how you interact with the community, maybe how you access buildings that might feel inaccessible to you. Since you shared a personal experience, I'll share a personal experience. I'm autistic, so when I feel too many senses going at once, I lose my central coherence, which means I can't understand what's happening around me and I stop being able to navigate a space, even though I look functional. So I think what we're talking about and where we need more research to help those feelings that you're having is around understanding our individual lived experience, and we can only do that through qualitative research and better co-design.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Ruth.
Could I just add something to that?
Please.
Is that all right? It's really more of a comment, but it's certainly the plight of older Australians with disability is an important one, and I just note that in terms of intersectionality, I think every other point of intersection with disability, whether it's age or youth or gender or sexuality, are represented by disability representative organisations. The only cohort who is not represented by a specific disability representative organisation that is tasked to represent their interests to government is older Australians. And we have been sort of advocating for that for some time, but with no luck. But, if anyone else wants to take up the cudgel, we'd be more than happy to help out. But yeah, I think, it's a really important point.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Matthew. So looking at the time, I just wanted to ask each of you, if we fund the wrong research this year, what are we going to miss? What opportunity are we going to miss to improve accessibility and inclusion? What's the risk if we keep doing what we've always done? I don't necessarily want to end on a negative note, but I think it's a challenging and important question to ask because we've got money to spend on research. We can fund some fantastic teams, but what's going to happen if we miss the boat, please? And I'm going to go first to you, Matthew.
Well, my answer is, I suppose, based on a very simple proposition of, if you keep continuing to do, there's that phrase, if you keep continuing to do what you've always done, you're not going to be surprised by the results. We will, if we continue to do what we've always done, we will continue to get the same inadequate results, and we won't see any meaningful or sustainable changes in infrastructure or the provision of information or attitudes, or perhaps most importantly, social, economic and political norms. We will miss out on opportunities to demonstrate the economic and social benefits of accessibility and the cost of an inaccessible society. I think, put simply, we won't see the changes that those in the video that we saw earlier, and in fact the whole very varied, diverse and beautiful disability community are crying out for. And as Jane Spring put it, to have the same freedom and spontaneity as every other Australian without disability, and not to have every movement around accessibility, pre-planned and thought out to the nth degree, because that's what you have to do to survive.
Sue speaking, thank you. Amy, I'm going to go to you next because I want to give Alex the last word, if that's okay. Amy, so for you, how do we make sure, what's the risk? How do we make sure that we're not just repeating the same things?
Absolutely. I think there's a really big risk that if we keep investing in research that describes the problem rather than solving the problem, we will never solve the problem. I know that sounds like such a simple statement, but too often we're looking at the parameters and we're not looking at people who have already taken a crack and had a go at trying to solve a problem. And then those people are the pilot is stuck in the past when it's something that could absolutely help us all into the future. So if we miss that opportunity, we will miss out on amazing brains that have been put into this, amazing lived experience that people can offer as possible solutions to these problems, and translate it into real world impact. We want to see practical real world impact analysis.
Sue speaking. Thank you, Amy. Alex, I'll throw to you.
Great question. Something I think about a lot as a person who reads policy reviews for fun. It's been a while since we ratified the UNCRPD, and we can say that within the first 10 years of that, we implemented some interesting structures, including the National Disability Strategy, because the UNCRPD gives us that structure through Article 33. We've got the NDIS, and we paused at that 10-year mark and we did a lot of reviews and we did a lot of thinking. And I think perhaps now more than any time, we're at a real critical juncture where we have a lot of information. We have the Disability Royal Commission recommendations and all the wonderful information that unearthed. We have the NDIS review, which actually talks about a holistic service system and not just the work of the agency. And in many ways, a lot of those recommendations are an incredible blueprint for how we move forward together. And I really love what Amy said. We do talk a lot about describing the problem, but we need to actually look at the structural solutions and work together, researchers, policy professionals, so that we can stand on that hill in another 10 years' time and say, look at what we've changed, look at what we managed to achieve together.
Sue speaking. Sorry, I was talking to myself there for a little bit on silent. I'm conscious of time. We've only got 5 more minutes in your diaries, people. So I'm going to jump straight to the so what question. Why were we getting together today? Why do we have these amazing people, both in the video, many of whom are online with us, but also to Alex, Amy, and Matthew. Thank you very much for engaging with us on this and sharing your views and your provocation for our future research teams. One of the things, so I've got 5 things up on the screen and I'm going to read them out. And this is part of all the information you can get from today. And I think this is probably the good summary of what we've heard from the panel and from the video is when you're putting your application into the NDRP, please, what decision or system could change because of this research? So what's actually going to happen? How will this research move to Amy's challenge just then beyond describing the problem? Do you have disability leadership shaping decisions, not just participation? That's both in your research, but also in what you're proposing to the policymakers, to Jane Britt's challenge in her video. Number 4, is the research feasible and scalable in the real world? So we don't want to discourage research in local communities. We want that to happen. but how is it going to apply to other people in other places and other challenges? And at the end of what you're proposing, what evidence is going to exist and who's going to use it? So to Alex's point about loving the policy cycle and loving the framework that Alex touched on about how we move from and evaluation through to looking at the issues again, etc. Who's going to use it? Who's going to pick it up? Who's going to apply it in their local spaces? So these are the things we really would like to encourage you. And as we run out of time, I want to say thank you very much to the over 110 people now who've stuck it out to the end. Thank you to Amy, to Matthew, to Alex, to our interpreters, and to our captioner, and to the people who shared their stories on the video. They're very used to being tapped on the shoulder by me, but thank you for sharing what was your personal insights on that. And thank you all for the engagement in the chat today. And we encourage you to check out the recording, to go back and sift through what has been a really deep discussion. And we really encourage you to share the information with others who will be part of your research teams, part of your application. So thank you very much. We will forward you the link to the recording and to the outputs of this discussion, really just to say thank you very much for joining us for this important discussion. The National Disability Research Partnership thanks you for your engagement, and we look forward to seeing some beautifully informed applications for research funding. Thank you all very much.